Jim Parsons spent more than a decade becoming the face of one of the biggest sitcoms in television history. And yet, the moment that pushed him away wasn't a fight, a contract dispute, or a creative disagreement. It was a quiet, painful turning point he never expected, triggered during the most overwhelming summer of his life. As the pressure of Broadway, network schedules, and personal heartbreak closed in on him, a single scene on set forced him to confront something far darker than exhaustion. It was the moment he realized Sheldon Cooper could no longer protect him from the truth he had been avoiding for years. And once he saw it, there was no way back. Jim Parsons had always been the definition of reliability on the set of The Big Bang Theory. For 11 seasons, he showed up perfectly prepared, never missing a beat, never letting the pressure of carrying the show's most demanding character slow him down. But during the break between seasons 11 and 12, everything around him began collapsing at once. While millions of viewers assumed he was living the dream, the world's highest-paid TV actor, the centerpiece of a series, pulling nearly 18 million viewers per episode, Jim himself was walking into the most emotionally brutal period of his life. It wasn't burnout in the normal sense. It was a collision of responsibilities he could no longer outrun. By early summer 2018, Jim was already stretched to the breaking point. He had committed to the Broadway revival of The Boys in the Band in New York, performing 8 shows a week, each one requiring total emotional precision. Every night he was on stage, and every few days he was on a plane, flying back to Los Angeles to film The Big Bang Theory, before immediately returning to New York to rehearse again. The schedule was physically damaging, mentally draining, and completely unsustainable. And still he pushed through it, because he had never allowed himself to slow down. But as this chaos unfolded, something far more devastating was happening at home. Jim and his husband Todd Spywalk had shared 2 dogs since Jim was 31. They were family constants in a life full of scripts, flights, and camera calls. And now one of them, 14 years old, was fading. Jim didn't have the luxury of stopping everything to be with him. He was performing, filming, memorizing lines, and being pulled across the country by obligations he felt he couldn't refuse. Yet every day, the fear grew. What if the dog he had loved for half his life died while he was away on set, pretending to be someone else? This was the first fracture, the crack that began widening in places Jim had long kept sealed. And he didn't yet realize that what was coming next would push him even further toward the breaking point. The day Jim Parsons finally understood how far he had been pushed came during what should have been a simple walk in the park. He had just flown back from Los Angeles after another round of filming. Exhausted from the nonstop flights, the rehearsals, and the pressure of appearing flawless every night on Broadway, he took his aging dog out for a quick bathroom break before heading to a commercial shoot scheduled around his impossibly tight timetable. But one look at the dog stopped him cold. 14 years of companionship were suddenly staring back at him in frailty, confusion, and pain. Jim felt something inside him collapse. Todd reminded him of their obligations, that an entire commercial crew had reorganized their schedule to accommodate Jim's impossible workload. But the moment Jim tried to keep moving, he broke. He cried openly, not from the stress of work, but from the guilt that he couldn't be fully present for the creature who had been a constant source of love when his life felt like a machine. In that instant, he realized how thoroughly he had lost control of his own time. He was performing everywhere for everyone except for the one place he desperately needed to be. The next day, he and Todd made the heartbreaking decision to put their dog to sleep at home. But grief rarely comes alone. Just days later, Jim returned to Broadway for another performance of The Boys in the Band. In the middle of a routine entrance, he felt a sharp, sickening snap in his foot. He finished the show anyway, refusing to stop, refusing to show weakness, refusing to disrupt anyone else's night. The behavior of a man who had forgotten to recognize his own limits. At the hospital, staring at x-rays, the fear washed over him. His body was fragile, and he had been pushing it beyond what it could safely endure. What if this injury had been worse? What if it took away the stage, the one place that had always made sense to him? It was here, limping out of the emergency room, that Jim realized the life he had been living was not sustainable. And soon, a far darker thought would rise to the surface, the one that would change everything. The injury should have been a warning, but for Jim Parsons, it became something much heavier, a mirror he could no longer avoid. As he sat alone after the hospital visit, foot bandaged and mind racing, a thought emerged that chilled him more than physical pain ever could. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't paranoia. It was memory. Jim's father had died suddenly at the age of 52. At the time, Jim was only 26, young enough to believe life was endless, but old enough to understand what it meant to lose a parent without warning. And now, in 2018, staring down the calendar, he realized something he had never allowed himself to face. By the end of season 12, he would be 46, just 6 years younger than the age his father never survived. The math hit him like a punch. 6 years. What if that was all he had left, too? What if the next decade wasn't guaranteed? For years, he had tried to outrun that fear, burying himself in work, piling projects on top of projects, exhausting himself to the edge of collapse. But in that moment, the truth was suddenly, painfully clear. If he continued on the same path, the last years of his life might belong to everyone but himself. He carried that thought through every performance, every flight, every table read. It echoed louder each time someone asked him to take on another project, another scene, another responsibility. He had always believed he had infinite time. Now he wasn't sure he had enough. And with that fear came an unexpected clarity. He didn't want to spend whatever time he had left repeating the same rhythms inside the same soundstage, wearing the same superhero shirts, delivering jokes he had mastered years earlier. So when Jim walked into Chuck's home one quiet Sunday, he wasn't just there to resign from a television show. He was there to reclaim his life. And as he sat down with the man who helped build Sheldon Cooper, he finally admitted the truth he had whispered only to himself until then. He needed to let go. Not because he was tired of the character, but because he was terrified of losing the years he might never get back. What came next would break the hearts of an entire cast. When Jim Parsons finally sat across from Chuck Lorre, it didn't feel like the triumphant moment people imagine when a superstar reclaims their life. It felt like the quiet surrender of someone who had been carrying a weight too heavy for too long. Chuck listened as Jim explained the truth he had avoided saying aloud for months. The exhaustion, the grief, the injury, the realization about his father's age. There was no dramatic argument, no bargaining, no attempt to change his mind. Chuck simply nodded, understanding what both men already knew. The Big Bang Theory could not exist without Sheldon Cooper. Jim didn't want more money. He didn't want fewer shooting days. What he wanted, for the first time in years, was simply space. Space to breathe, to rest, to create something new without the pressure of being the face of a global empire. Chuck accepted his decision with quiet compassion, but he also acknowledged the consequence that would follow. If Jim left, the show would end. There was no way around it. The next step was far more painful. A few days after speaking to Chuck, Jim gathered the main cast in his dressing room. Johnny Galecki, Kay Cuoco, Simon Helberg, Kunal Nair, Mayim Bialik, and Melissa Rowell. People he had spent 12 years with, people who had become a type of family formed under studio lights. Jim told them what he had told Chuck. The room fell silent before the tears began. Johnny later admitted he felt blindsided, not because Jim was leaving, but because he went to the producers first. After more than a decade together, Johnny believed the cast should have heard it from him privately. But the more the shock wore off, the more they all understood something deeper. Jim might have been the only one brave enough to say out loud what they had all been feeling in different ways. The show had run its course. They were proud, grateful, but undeniably tired. Still, the news hit them like a loss. Kay Cuoco posted that she was drowning in tears. Mayim Bialik wrote about feeling bittersweet gratitude. Everyone knew the journey had been extraordinary, but no journey, no matter how successful, can outrun time. And now the end was unavoidable. When the cast finally processed Jim Parsons' decision, the weight of what it meant began rippling quietly through the Warner Brothers lot. The writers had stories still outlined on whiteboards. CBS was prepared to greenlight more seasons, without hesitation. The ratings were stronger than ever, rare for a sitcom entering its 12th year. But all of that became irrelevant with Jim's announcement. Without Sheldon, there was no center of gravity, no dynamic strong enough to hold the ensemble together. And within days, CBS and Warner Brothers accepted reality. Season 12 would be the final chapter. On August 22nd, 2018, the world learned what the cast had already cried over. The Big Bang Theory would end in 2019. Fans were shocked. Headlines immediately speculated about money, creative differences, or secret conflicts. Some outlets claimed Jim had turned down a $50 million contract, a number repeated so loudly that it almost became myth. But the truth, as Jim later clarified, was far less dramatic and far more human. There was no official offer, no ultimatum. The negotiations for seasons 13 and 14 had barely begun when he made his choice. He wasn't rejecting millions. He was rejecting the idea of losing the last years of his life to a schedule that had already consumed him. As filming continued, the atmosphere on set shifted. There was gratitude, but also a quiet mourning. The actors found themselves treasuring ordinary moments, rehearsal jokes, shared looks during tapings, late-night conversations in dressing rooms. They weren't just ending a show. They were ending an era of their lives. For Jim, each scene felt like closing a chapter in a book he loved, but could no longer rewrite. And though he feared he might regret the decision, he also felt an unfamiliar calm. It wasn't the relief of quitting. It was the relief of choosing his future before life chose it for him. When the 2-hour finale finally aired, 18.5 million people tuned in. Millions more streamed it afterward. And as Jim delivered Sheldon's last speech, thanking his friends for their patience, their sacrifices, their love, he wasn't just playing a character. He was saying goodbye to the life that had defined him for 12 years. But what came after would prove he had made the right decision. When The Big Bang Theory wrapped in May 2019, Jim Parsons walked off stage 25 at Warner Brothers, not as the highest-paid actor on television, but as a man finally free to breathe. For the first time in more than a decade, he woke up without call sheets, without rehearsals, without the pressure of embodying a character whose voice had become as recognizable as his own. Fans expected him to take a long break, but Jim didn't retreat from the industry. He simply redirected himself toward work that fed his soul instead of draining it. He continued narrating Young Sheldon, the prequel series that became a massive hit in its own right, and stayed connected to the universe he helped create until that show's conclusion in 2024. But he no longer carried the weight of being the face of a billion-dollar franchise. Instead, he explored new corners of his craft. In Ryan Murphy's Netflix series Hollywood, he delivered a chilling Emmy-nominated performance as powerful talent agent Henry Wilson, a role so far removed from Sheldon Cooper that critics praised it as a career-redefining transformation. It proved he hadn't left The Big Bang Theory because he was finished acting. He left because he needed room to grow. In 2022, Jim starred in Spoiler Alert, bringing emotional depth to a story about love and terminal illness, a film that reminded audiences he had always been more than a sitcom star. Meanwhile, his stage career continued to flourish. He returned to Broadway in productions of A Man of No Importance, Mother Play, and Our Town in 2024, earning acclaim for performances that demanded vulnerability rather than comedic precision. He became once again the theater actor he had always been at heart. Looking back, Jim has said he never regretted his decision. The moment that broke him, that infamous emotional collapse during a walk in the park, compounded by grief, injury, exhaustion, and the memory of a father who never made it past 52, became the moment that ultimately saved him. It allowed him to step away before resentment, fatigue, or tragedy forced his hand. He didn't leave because he stopped loving the show. He left because he finally started choosing himself. Jim Parsons didn't walk away from one of the biggest sitcoms in history because of ego, salary disputes, or burnout in the traditional sense. He walked away because life reminded him painfully that time is the one thing even the brightest stars cannot negotiate. His decision ended an era, but it also gave him back the freedom he had been sacrificing for years. Now the real question is simple. Do you think Jim made the right choice for himself? If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so we can keep bringing you more true Hollywood stories just like this.